In June 1941, the frontier between the Soviet Union and German-occupied Europe was not only a political line, but also a logistics hinge. Behind the German side stood rail networks oriented toward east-west traffic and supply dumps prepositioned for a campaign. On the Soviet side, the Red Army had expanded rapidly into territories annexed in 1939 to 1940, while its supply system was still anchored deeper inside the old borders. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowed from industrial centers along east-west railways, but many forward depots were incomplete, understocked, or not yet connected to the new garrisons along the Bug and Niemen. The Mechanized Corps, formed in 1940 to 1941, embodied this imbalance. On paper, a Soviet mechanized corps in the western districts might field more than 1,000 tanks, including several hundred modern T-34s and KV heavy tanks mixed with older BT and T-26 models. In practice, these formations often had only half of their authorized trucks, incomplete repair battalions, and fuel battalions that existed mostly as tables in regulations. Training reports from Western Special Military District and Baltic Special Military District in spring 1941 already complained that tank units received limited driving hours because fuel allocations were conserved for a future war. Strategic planning framed fuel as an enabler for offensive operations. The pre-war cover plans and variants of forward counterstroke concepts assumed that if Germany attacked, Soviet mechanized corps would advance rapidly into East Prussia and occupied Poland. In these scenarios, fuel depots and railheads were to be pushed forward behind the advancing tank units. Less attention was given to the possibility that corps would have to retreat under pressure while still dependent on fixed rail delivery and a small number of motor transport battalions. Geography and politics further complicated the picture. The western districts included territories of eastern Poland and the Baltic states, where Soviet infrastructure building had begun only after 1939. Many of the new tank parks, airfields and warehouses were still under construction in June 1941. Some depots remained small railside storage points without hardened protection, road links, or pipelines. Large stocks of fuel were concentrated in a limited number of older depots farther to the east, connected by rail lines that ran through vulnerable junctions close to the frontier. On the German side, planners for Operation Barbarossa paid close attention to rail gauge, bridge capacity, and fuel stocks. Before 22nd June, engineer units surveyed crossings, aerial reconnaissance mapped Soviet rail nodes, and fuel columns assembled forward for the opening march. German intelligence underestimated the number of modern Soviet tanks, but correctly identified many major depots and rail hubs in the border belt, Luftwaffe target lists. For the first days of the war included not only airfields but also junctions and marshalling yards through which Soviet fuel would have to move toward the front. The technical characteristics of the T-34 interacted with these structural issues. The new tank offered thicker armour and a 76mm gun, but it was heavier than the BT series and placed more strain on engines, transmissions, and fuel consumption. Maintenance routines, spare parts, and recovery equipment for T-30s lagged behind deliveries of the tanks themselves. Many corps received mixed fleets, where drivers trained on older models, but were then expected to operate T-34s in long road marches with minimal familiarization. Fuel planners and depot officers had to support several fuel and oil types simultaneously, often without complete documentation or experience. Within the Soviet command system, responsibility for fuel was divided among staff branches. The People Commissariat of Defense set norms. The main Directorate of Fuel Supply managed overall stocks, and front and district quartermasters were tasked with creating forward reserves reports from the Western Front in early 1941, already pointed to shortages of motor transport and storage tanks, and to delays in converting more distant warehouses into forward depots. Yet the political context of a recently signed neutrality pact with Japan and a still functioning trade relationship with Germany discouraged open discussion of a near-term large-scale German attack. The result was a pattern in which tanks and corps headquarters were pushed west faster than the infrastructure that would keep them moving. For civilians living along the new border, these preparations were visible mainly as columns of vehicles on the roads, construction around rail junctions, and the arrival of new garrisons. Few outside the military bureaucracy saw fuel as a problem. Oil shipments from the Caucasus continued to move, and official publications emphasized the growth of Soviet industry. Inside staffs, however, the contrast between ambitious mechanized tables of organization and the slower growth of supply services was already clear by June 1941. This gap set the stage for what would happen when the front line dissolved, and fuel had to be delivered, not to planned axes of advance, but to formations trying to maneuver in the face of a rapid German offensive. Shortly after 3 in the morning on 22nd June 1941, artillery flashes began to line the western horizon. Across hundreds of kilometers, German guns opened fire on Soviet frontier posts, while Luftwaffe aircraft headed for airfields, bridges, and rail junctions. At first, many Soviet headquarters registered the bombardment as local incidents or provocations. Within hours, reports from multiple sectors confirmed that German forces had crossed the border in strength mobilization orders, went out by phone and courier, including instructions for mechanized corps to move toward designated concentration areas for counterstrokes. For the tank formations in the western military districts, these orders collided with their fuel reality. Corps whose peacetime parks lay 50 to 100 kilometers behind the frontier had only partial stocks in their immediate depots. Fuel columns were supposed to draw from railheads that in turn depended on scheduled deliveries from the interior. On the first day of war, many of those trains were halted or diverted as the Central Command tried to understand the scale of the attack. Some trains stood under steam at marshalling yards that were already on Luftwaffe target lists. Bomb damage and fires at junctions disrupted timetables that had been planned for peacetime conditions. At corps level, staff officers attempted to implement pre-war counterstroke plans that assumed orderly deployment. Tank regiments were instructed to leave their parks, assemble into columns, and move towards staging areas close to the border. Fuel officers had to decide whether to send vehicles forward on the fuel already in their internal tanks, or to wait for additional deliveries from rear depots. In several western districts, commanders chose to move at once, fearing that delay would allow German units to penetrate deeply. Columns of T-34s, KV heavy tanks, BTS, and T-26 rolled out through towns still unaware that a major war had begun. On the ground, the road space and consumption norms quickly diverged from theory. Columns that were supposed to move along roads reserved for military traffic instead found themselves sharing space with retreating border units and civilian carts. Detours around damaged bridges or blocked intersections added tens of kilometers to routes. Engines ran at low speeds and in lower gears, burning more fuel than anticipated in planning tables that had assumed uninterrupted cruising. Each additional halt and restart consumed fuel that could not be replaced until the column rejoined a functioning supply point. German reports for the first days note the appearance of Soviet tank units moving toward the frontier in relatively coherent order. In some sectors, advance elements of panzer groups encountered counter-attacking Soviet formations that had managed to concentrate despite the air raids and confusion. Yet German aerial reconnaissance also recorded burning fuel depots and stationary rail tankers near key junctions, evidence that the Soviet system delivering fuel to those mechanized corps was already under strain. At Soviet front and army headquarters, the picture that formed on 22nd June was fragmented. Messages arrived about German breakthroughs, destroyed bridges, and interruptions in telephone lines. Alongside these reports came urgent requests for fuel and lubricants from mechanized corps that had set out on long marches. Staff officers tried to reroute deliveries from deeper depots, but this required intact rail lines to forward stations and available trucks to shuttle fuel onward to the roads where tanks were moving. Many formations had only a portion of their authorized motor transport battalions present, and those vehicles were already committed to moving artillery, infantry, and staff elements. Civilians near large rail nodes often experienced the logistical crisis indirectly. Some towns awoke to explosions as bombs struck marshalling yards loaded with fuel and ammunition. Columns of black smoke from hit or deliberately destroyed tank cars could be seen from many kilometers away. Railway workers tried to shunt surviving cars out of danger and clear lines for evacuation trains carrying wounded and equipment. In the confusion, some fuel trains were sent back toward the interior, while others stopped at temporary sidings without clear instructions where to unload. In the first 24 hours of fighting, the T-34 as a weapon system showed both its strengths and its dependence on fuel that could no longer be assumed. Crews who reached their assigned assembly areas reported that the new tanks could withstand hits from many German anti-tank guns and that their 76mm guns were effective. At the same time, they recorded that marches of 150 to 200 kilometers under combat conditions had left fuel tanks close to empty. Without replenishment, the Corps could either halt in place or burn their remaining fuel attempting to reach new positions. German advance units, focused on their own objectives, did not yet grasp the scale of the Soviet fuel distribution problem. Their diaries for 22nd June record destroyed depots, abandoned rail equipment, and occasional large Soviet tank counter-thrusts. For Soviet staffs, the same period already highlighted a contradiction between ambitious orders for immediate counter-offensives and the limited capacity of the logistics system to support rapid movements by thousands of vehicles. The decisions taken that day to move mechanized corps forward at once would shape their condition when they reached the frontier battlefields later in the week, with fuel reserves already depleted and resupply routes under sustained attack. The strategic objectives assigned to Soviet mechanized corps before June 1941 framed fuel as a resource for offensive maneuver, not for endurance under retreat. Cover plans for the Western Special, Baltic Special, and Kiev Special military districts envisioned several mechanized corps advancing quickly into East Prussia and occupied Poland to disrupt German groupings near the frontier. Tables specified daily march distances of 30 to 40 kilometers for combined arms formations and higher rates for tank spearheads. Fuel norms were calculated accordingly, assuming that corps would move along roads secured by friendly infantry and supported by railheads that advanced as the front line moved west. Within this framework, planners expected to accumulate a forward fuel reserve to sustain the first week of operations. Documents from Western Front logistics organs show intended fuel stocks near key rail junctions such as Minsk and Bialystok, with additional depots in the rear districts. The ideal model featured echeloned storage, main depots in the interior, intermediate depots around operational centres, and forward depots near assembly areas. However, construction delays, shortages of storage tanks, and limited time since annexation meant that by June 1941, the forward echelon existed only partially. Several mechanized corps began the campaign depending on depots located 1 or 2 rail stages behind their peacetime locations, rather than near the planned counteroffensive axes. Planning also assumed that rail transport would remain under Soviet control. Schedules projected a continuous flow of fuel trains from the Caucasus and Volga regions toward western depots. Staff calculations treated railways as a secure conveyor, vulnerable mainly to isolated sabotage rather than sustained interdiction. Bridging units and repair teams existed, but the prospect of systematic air attack on marshalling yards, bridges, and signalling installations on the first day of war did not feature prominently in pre-war exercises. When war came, Luftwaffe strikes on junctions and rail sabotage by German special units and local collaborators transformed the theoretical conveyor into a sequence of disconnected segments. German operational planning for Barbarossa incorporated fuel capture and denial as explicit secondary aims. Army Group directives emphasized rapid advance to seize Soviet depots, rail centers, and bridge crossings before they could be demolished. Railway engineer commands prepared to convert Soviet broad-gauge track and restore traffic as they advanced. German fuel services calculated that their own stocks could sustain the opening marches only if captured Soviet fuel supplemented them. This created a situation in which Soviet depots near the frontier were simultaneously essential for Red Army mechanized corps and attractive targets for German ground and air forces. Soviet fuel distribution planning reflected broader organizational tensions. The rapid expansion of mechanized forces in 1940 to 1941 produced more than 20 mechanized corps on paper, but the fuel service for these formations did not grow at the same rate. Each corps was supposed to have fuel battalions, mobile filling stations, and tanker trucks capable of refueling hundreds of tanks in the field. In practice, many corps had only a fraction of the required vehicles, and some fuel subunits existed mainly as cadre. Rear services regulations acknowledged that corps might be forced to operate temporarily without full organic fuel support, drawing instead on front and army-level reserves. This assumption required those higher echelons to have functioning depots and transport of their own. Within headquarters discussions, some officers argued for concentrating fuel in larger depots farther from the border to reduce vulnerability to sudden attacks. Others stressed the need to push stocks forward to support the planned counterblows. The compromise often left forward depots underfilled and rear depots heavily stocked, but too distant for rapid response. The Western Front quartermaster system, for example, held significant reserves east of Minsk, while corps near Bialystok and Grodno had only limited local stocks on June 22nd. Rail timetables were supposed to close this gap in the first days of mobilization. Mechanized corps commanders and their chiefs of staff had to translate these abstract plans into orders. They received peacetime fuel limits that restricted large-scale training marches, but they also studied operational directives describing deep counteroffensives. Exercises frequently used reduced numbers of vehicles to simulate larger formations, masking the true logistical burden. When war orders spoke of advancing tens or hundreds of kilometers in a short time, many staffs did not have practical experience of sustaining that movement with real fuel consumption rates, real road congestion, and real maintenance demands on mixed fleets that included T-34s alongside older models. For German commanders, the expectation was that Soviet mechanized reactions would be strong but disjointed. Panzer Group staffs planned to bypass or encircle large enemy groupings while targeting rail and road nodes that fed them. Luftwaffe field commands allocated bomber and dive bomber groups to attack not only troop concentrations, but also the infrastructure that supported Soviet logistics: rail yards, depots, bridges, and crossings. Sabotage teams infiltrated before 22nd June were tasked with damaging signal boxes, blowing minor bridges, and sowing confusion on lines that supplied Western Soviet districts. Civilians, including railway workers and depot staff, found themselves embedded in these strategic calculations. Their routine tasks, loading tank cars, operating pumps, maintaining track, were integral to the pre-war fuel system, yet contingency planning for their evacuation or for depot dispersal in case of sudden attack was incomplete. Fuel tended to be stored in large, conspicuous facilities near important junctions rather than in dispersed camouflage sites. When bombardment and ground breakthroughs came, the very concentration that made these depots efficient in peacetime made them vulnerable and difficult to replace. The gap between planned offensive fuel consumption and the realities of disrupted distribution would soon appear in reports from mechanized corps forced to halt, not by enemy fire alone, but by empty fuel tanks. On 23rd to 24th June, the first large-scale encounters between Soviet mechanized corps and German panzer groups exposed the fragile link between tank strength on paper and fuel available on the roads. Orders for counterstrokes reached corps whose brigades were still strung out along march routes, many vehicles already low on fuel after continuous movement from peacetime locations. When staff maps marked arrows toward German spearheads, fuel officers had to calculate whether their units could even reach the start lines. In the Western Front sector, mechanized corps moving toward the Bialystok salient illustrate the pattern. Tank divisions that had left parks deep inside the district had already covered more than 150 kilometers, often on secondary roads. Reports from these formations describe columns halting not from enemy action, but because fuel trucks had fallen behind, been destroyed in air attacks, or diverted to support other units. T-34s and KV heavy tanks that had impressed crews with their power now stood at road verges with empty fuel tanks, their engines silent, while older, lighter vehicles, with slightly better consumption, sometimes managed to continue. German advance reports from the same days mention scattered engagements with Soviet tanks that appeared in groups rather than in the mass expected from Soviet order of battle, Panzer Regiment logs, note contacts with individual battalions or companies of modern Soviet tanks that fought briefly and then withdrew or became stationary targets. Air crew from reconnaissance units photographed columns of Soviet vehicles apparently abandoned along roads, some damaged, others intact, but without visible fuel support. For German analysts, these images suggested both the strength of Soviet mechanization and the weakness of its operational use. At the divisional level inside Soviet mechanized corps, the fuel shortage shaped tactical choices. Commanders, who received orders for counterattacks, had to decide whether to commit their remaining fuel to a single push or to conserve it for later defensive actions. Some divisions concentrated the last full fuel loads in a portion of their T-34s and KV tanks, leaving other vehicles parked and forming ad hoc battle groups. This produced local actions in which German units suddenly faced clusters of well-armed Soviet tanks, while a short distance away, entire regiments remained immobile. Civilian experience along the march routes reflected this uneven pattern. Villagers saw long columns pass, then hours later found tanks and trucks standing motionless in fields or on side roads. Crews waited for fuel that might arrive by night, guarded their vehicles, and sometimes received orders to prepare for demolition if towing or refueling proved impossible. In some localities, fuel stocks from civilian facilities were requisitioned to support military needs, but the volumes available from small depots and service points could not replace the missing rail tank cars and army fuel columns. German ground troops advancing behind the leading panzer units soon began to encounter Soviet armour left behind by these logistic failures. Infantry divisions entering areas already crossed by mechanized corps reported rows of abandoned or burned-out tanks, including T-34s, whose armour and guns were still unfamiliar to many German soldiers. Technical teams examined the vehicles and noted that some showed no battle damage but lacked fuel and minor components. These findings fed into German intelligence assessments and later capture inventories, which listed significant numbers of usable Soviet tanks taken over after minimal repair and refueling. Within Western Front headquarters, situation reports for the first 3 days recorded both combat losses and non-combat write-offs. Formations reported that a proportion of their tanks had to be left along march routes because fuel did not arrive in time or because towing capacity was insufficient. Some corps quartermasters requested permission to drain remaining fuel from immobilized vehicles to keep a smaller number of tanks operational. Such measures could sustain limited counterattacks or defensive stands, but accelerated the overall reduction of corps strength. In parallel, rail disruption deepened the crisis. Sabotaged or destroyed bridges and junctions prevented fuel trains from reaching designated unloading points. In some cases, trains arrived at stations already threatened by German ground forces, forcing hurried unloading or emergency rerouting. Tank cars were left on sidings or destroyed to prevent capture. further reducing the pool of available fuel. This created a chain reaction. The fewer trains that reached Western depots, the fewer truckloads could be dispatched to mechanized corps, and the more vehicles had to be abandoned in place. By the end of 24 June, the opening engagements around the frontier and the Bialystok region had produced an apparent paradox. On maps, Soviet mechanized corps still existed as symbols with nominal tank strengths, including several hundred T-30s foes in the Western Front alone. On the ground, many of those tanks were no longer mobile. Some had been lost in battle, but many more stood intact but unfueled, awaiting orders that could not change the absence of fuel in their tanks. For German panzer groups pushing east, this meant that opposition from Soviet armor came in bursts rather than as a continuous shield, a pattern closely tied to the disintegration of Soviet fuel distribution in the first days of the campaign. By 25th of June, the fighting had widened into a belt of crises along the Western Front. German panzer groups pushed past the initial frontier battles toward Vilnius, Minsk, and the crossings of the Niemen and Narev. Soviet command tried to reconstitute a coherent line, issuing new directives for counterattacks and withdrawals almost daily. Mechanized corps that had already consumed most of their fuel in initial marches were now ordered to change direction, cover additional distances, or break through toward threatened sectors. Each new movement order multiplied their consumption without solving the underlying supply gap. Western Front logistics reports from these days recorded a shrinking pool of usable fuel. Depots near Grodno, Bialystok, and Brest reported destruction or evacuation under pressure stocks that survived bombing needed to be moved quickly or risk capture. Quartermasters requested authority to release strategic reserves held farther east, but moving those reserves required functioning rail lines. Railway reports noted destroyed bridges over the Niemen and Bug, damaged signal systems, and sections of track under air attack. Even where fuel wagons reached intermediate stations, the number of available tanker trucks to move fuel forward to mechanized corps was insufficient. On the ground, mechanized corps staffs issued increasingly urgent fuel requests. Some formations documented that more than half of their tanks were now immobile for non-combat reasons, parked along roads or in forest clearings. To avoid detection, divisions prioritized fuel for reconnaissance units, command vehicles, and a limited number of combat tanks needed to cover retreats or mount local counterstrikes. In practice, this meant that a corps that nominally fielded hundreds of tanks could assemble only a few dozen for any given action. The rest remained static assets that could be abandoned, destroyed, or captured, depending on how the front moved. German forces exploited the gaps created by this immobility. Panzer and motorized infantry units bypassed concentrations of disabled Soviet armor, leaving them to following infantry divisions and technical detachments. When these units arrived, they surveyed what Soviet crews had left behind. Capture reports described T-34s and KV tanks with intact weapons but empty fuel tanks, vehicles sabotaged by holes in fuel lines, and others burned out near fuel dumps that had been set on fire during retreat. Where time and resources allowed, German workshops refueled and repaired some tanks for evaluation and limited combat use, adding them to inventories compiled for higher headquarters. Civilian and railway personnel faced their own escalation of strain. Evacuation trains carrying factories, archives, and personnel shared tracks with military traffic, while refugees moved along roads needed for fuel columns. Local authorities ordered the removal or destruction of fuel stocks in towns close to the advancing front. In some places, drums and tank cars were opened, and their contents poured out and burned. In others, lack of clear orders led to depots being left intact until German units arrived. The same installations that had been central nodes in the Soviet fuel system now fed German advance columns when captured with minimal damage. Within Soviet headquarters, the tone of reports changed from confidence in planned counteroffensives to concern about encirclement. The developing Bialystok-Minsk pocket threatened to trap multiple armies and their supporting services, mechanized corps inside or near this emerging encirclement tried to maneuver out, but doing so required fuel that many no longer possessed. Orders to break through toward Minsk or toward the east often resulted in partial movements in which some battalions advanced while others could not leave their positions. Crews of immobilized tanks received instructions to remove sights, machine guns, and radios, and to prepare detonators if towing remained impossible. Parallel patterns appeared on other fronts. In the Kiev Special Military District, later Southwestern Front, mechanized corps engaged in the Dubno-Lutsk-Brody battles also reported high non-combat write-offs due to fuel shortages, long marches, and disrupted supply. While their tactical situations differed, the underlying mechanism was similar. Large tank formations operating farther forward than their fuel infrastructure could support, under continuous pressure from airstrikes and ground advances against rail and road links. By June 26th to 27th, the cumulative effect of these factors was clear in daily returns. Western Front armoured strength figures began to show sharp declines out of proportion to reported combat losses. Staff summaries noted that a significant share of tanks had been abandoned or disabled during marches. The intent behind pre-war planning, to use mechanized corps as instruments of deep offensive maneuver, confronted the reality of formations whose fuel distribution could not keep pace with the tempo of operations imposed by the German advance. The crisis that emerged in this first week was not a single event, but a chain of decisions and constraints that immobilized hundreds of tanks before many of them could engage in sustained combat. Between 27th and 30th June, the campaign on the central sector reached a peak in which mobility became the decisive factor. Panzer groups advancing from the border had already crossed the Niemen and Narów and were driving toward Minsk. Their orders were to encircle Soviet forces in the Bialystok-Minsk region and reach new lines far to the east. For Western Front headquarters, the priority became preventing encirclement and stabilizing a defensive line closer to the Dnieper Mechanized Corps, already worn down by marches and piecemeal combat, were tasked with covering retreats, delaying German spearheads, and securing corridors for withdrawal. In this phase, fuel shortages turned into immobilization on a large scale. Corps that had begun the campaign with several hundred tanks now reported that only a fraction remained operational. Daily summaries noted that vehicles lost in combat formed only part of the total. Many more had been left along the march routes or near temporary positions when fuel failed to arrive. The pattern was cumulative. Each emergency movement order, often issued at short notice in response to new German penetrations, consumed remaining reserves in scattered efforts to plug gaps. On the German side, the drive toward Minsk tested their own logistics, but also yielded increasing numbers of captured Soviet vehicles. Reports from Army and Army Group level recorded depots, railheads, and parks taken with stocks of fuel, lubricants, and spare parts alongside intact or lightly damaged tanks. Technical officers inspecting Soviet equipment found modern tanks whose main limiting factor had been fuel repaired and refueled. Some of these vehicles were sent to test ranges or incorporated in small numbers into German units for evaluation. For Soviet mechanized corps, the last days of June often combined intense local fighting with extensive non-combat loss. Near Minsk and along the routes leading toward the city, tank battalions deployed to resist German thrusts, while other vehicles remained motionless for lack of fuel. Commanders faced choices between concentrating remaining fuel to form one last counterattack group or distributing it more thinly to maintain a broader but weaker screen. In some instances, they chose to fuel heavy and medium tanks for direct engagement while leaving lighter models in place. In others, fuel went to vehicles capable of towing guns, and supply wagons needed to keep infantry moving. Civilians inside the emerging encirclement observed different stages of this process. Early in the week, they had seen armoured columns moving east and west, often under air attack. By 28th to 29th June, Many villages and towns contained scattered groups of Soviet tanks standing silent in fields or tree lines, crews waiting for orders that might not come. When German units approached, some crews detonated charges to disable their vehicles, destroying fuel that might otherwise be captured. Others withdrew on foot or were taken prisoner. The material trace of the fuel crisis appeared in these clusters of burned or abandoned T-34s and other types along the roads toward Minsk. Rail and depot records show how quickly the logistical framework unraveled. Trains dispatched from interior depots often never reached their intended destinations. Some were rerouted repeatedly as junctions fell under attack. Others stopped at improvised unloading points, where local authorities tried to distribute fuel with limited numbers of trucks. A few succeeded in refueling retreating units, but many arrived too late or too far to affect the condition of mechanized corps already trapped in the tightening ring around Western Front's main forces. At Western Front headquarters and at the level of the General Staff in Moscow, situation reports from this period highlighted both human and material losses. The encirclement developing west of Minsk threatened entire armies, their artillery, and their supply services. Mechanized corps within this pocket reported virtually exhausted fuel stocks, with remaining vehicles reserved for short breakout attempts or close defense of key positions. Requests for fuel and ammunition competed with urgent appeals for permission to withdraw or to establish new lines farther east. Under these pressures, higher command prioritized saving personnel and maintaining some form of front over recovering immobilized equipment. German capture inventories compiled after the closure of the Bialystok-Minsk pocket reflected the end result. They listed not only guns and trucks, but also large numbers of Soviet tanks in varying condition. Among them were modern models whose combat potential had been limited less by armor and armament than by the absence of fuel at critical moments. For German analysts, these documents illustrated both the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union and the organizational difficulties that had prevented that capacity from translating into sustained operational mobility in June 1941. By 30 June, the Western Front as an effective operational entity had been largely broken. The peak of the campaign on this sector, measured in distance advanced by German formations and in Soviet formations encircled, coincided with the moment when the fuel distribution system that was supposed to sustain Soviet mechanized corps had effectively collapsed. The immobilization of many T-30's foes and other tanks during this week was not an isolated occurrence, but the visible outcome of pre-war planning assumptions colliding with the realities of disrupted railways, lost depots, and insufficient motor transport under conditions of rapid, large-scale offensive warfare. As reports from the Western Front reached Moscow in the last days of June, resistance and adaptation began at multiple levels. At the front, officers and crews worked with the means at hand. Fuel officers organized improvised collection teams to drain remaining fuel from immobilized vehicles and redistribute it to those still capable of movement. In some mechanized corps, this produced small mobile groups of T-34s and KV tanks, supported by a handful of trucks, while the bulk of the park remained in place. These groups covered retreats, protected road junctions, or formed the spearheads of breakout attempts from areas threatened by encirclement. Infantry and artillery units also adapted to the fading presence of tank support. Where mechanized corps could no longer assemble large formations, individual tanks or small platoons were attached to rifle divisions to strengthen local defenses. Crews had to fight from positions reached on their last fuel load, often selecting ground with better fields of fire and concealment. With recovery vehicles in short supply and fuel even scarcer, disabled tanks were sometimes converted into static firing points until ammunition was exhausted or German forces approached closely. German troops encountered this mix of resistance and breakdown as they advanced. Panzer regiments often fought Soviet tanks that appeared in small but determined groups, while reconnaissance elements reported long stretches of road lined with abandoned vehicles. German engineers and supply officers adapted by incorporating captured Soviet fuel stocks into their own logistics. Where depots or rail tank cars were taken intact, their contents were sampled and, if compatible, transferred to German vehicles. Captured trucks, tractors, and occasionally tanks were refueled and pressed into service to supplement stretched motor transport. On the Soviet side, higher command began to adjust organizational structures even as the first week of fighting continued. Directives circulated to reduce dependence on large mechanized corps in favor of smaller tank formations that could be supplied more flexibly. Preliminary discussions started about forming independent tank brigades and reinforcing rifle divisions with attached tank units, rather than relying on massed corps operating far ahead of their supply bases. These conversations were informed by front-level reports describing how rapidly mechanized corps had lost operational mobility once rail links and depots were disrupted. Railway and depot services also attempted to adapt. Where main lines had been cut, local railway administrations organized short shuttle runs between surviving junctions, using any available locomotives and cruise fuel that could no longer be delivered to the original front depots was unloaded at secondary stations and dispersed in smaller caches. Civilian drivers were mobilized with their vehicles to supplement army transport, carrying drums and canisters to meet retreating columns. These efforts rarely restored mechanized corps to full strength, but did allow some units to receive enough fuel to continue eastward or to avoid complete encirclement. Within the encircled Bialystok-Minsk area, resistance combined tactical ingenuity with grim calculations about equipment. Commanders organized breakout groups composed of units that still had some fuel and ammunition, often focusing on infantry and artillery that could move on foot or horse transport. Tanks with minimal fuel were assigned to cover these movements, fighting rear-guard actions until their last reserves were spent. Crews then destroyed their vehicles to prevent capture and attempted to withdraw on foot. In some sectors, scattered groups succeeded in reaching new Soviet lines farther east, bringing experience of the fuel crisis with them. German command structures integrated lessons from these early encounters as well. Reports from panzer and infantry divisions highlighted the vulnerability of Soviet logistics infrastructure to air and ground attack and confirmed that continued pressure on rail nodes and depots reduced the intensity of Soviet armoured resistance. Army group staffs issued further instructions to prioritize rail junctions, bridges, and large storage facilities as targets, reinforcing a cycle in which Soviet attempts to restore fuel distribution faced mounting obstacles. Psychologically, the experience of immobilization affected both sides. Soviet tank crews and mechanics who had trained on modern vehicles now found themselves forced to abandon them without sustained combat. Many wrote in later testimonies that they saw rows of serviceable tanks left behind, solely because fuel and towing capacity were lacking. German soldiers, for their part, saw evidence of an opponent with considerable industrial output, but whose organization had been caught unprepared for the demands of a fast-moving campaign. For both, the first week established expectations about Soviet armor, formidable in individual engagements, but unevenly supplied and vulnerable when its logistics faltered. Even as the Western Front disintegrated as a cohesive force, the Soviet command used surviving communications to gather data. Western Front logistics reports, capture lists recovered later, and rail service summaries all contributed to an emerging analysis in Moscow of why so many tanks, including a significant number of T-34s, had been lost without long periods of operation. These early attempts at understanding did not immediately solve the crisis on the ground, but they marked the beginning of a shift in doctrine and organization that treated fuel supply, depot siting, and transport capacity as central elements of armored warfare rather than background assumptions. The first week of war ended without formal declarations of a turning point, yet decisions taken in its aftermath began to change how both sides viewed Soviet armor and its logistics. For German commanders, the closure of the Bialystok-Minsk encirclement by the start of July signaled that the initial operational objectives on the central sector had been met. Reports detailing the quantity of captured equipment, including tanks, guns, and fuel stocks, reinforced the impression that Soviet forces had been structurally unprepared. Among these documents were capture inventories listing T-34s and other tanks found abandoned or lightly damaged. Many reported with empty fuel tanks and intact weapons. At Soviet General Staff level, the same events triggered internal assessments. Telegrams and front reports that arrived in Moscow during and after the encirclement described formations that had lost the majority of their tanks not through prolonged combat, but through a combination of fuel exhaustion, mechanical breakdown, and inability to tow or repair under fire. Staff officers began to collate figures. Numbers of tanks sent west before 22nd June, numbers reported in daily returns, and numbers that could be accounted for after units broke out or reformed. The discrepancies prompted questions about depot locations, rail capacities, and the organization of fuel services within mechanized corps. One turning point lay in the recognition that pre-war assumptions about secure rail delivery and forward depots had been overtaken by events. Plans that placed large quantities of fuel in a limited number of depots near key junctions had made sense in peacetime. Under conditions of massed air attack and rapid ground advances, those depots either became targets or fell into enemy hands. Reports from Western Front logistics officers described depots destroyed by bombing, depots demolished by their own troops during retreats, and depots captured intact when orders to evacuate or destroy arrived too late. In each case, the result for mechanized corps was the same: a sudden loss of the fuel on which their mobility depended. Another turning point occurred in the perception of the T-34 itself. Before the war, it had been viewed primarily as a technical solution to expected German armor developments. German field reports from the first week acknowledged its capabilities, noting armor that resisted current anti-tank guns and a main armament effective at typical engagement ranges. Soviet internal reviews, however, emphasized that these advantages could not compensate for systemic weaknesses in support. The image that emerged in July was of a tank that was technically competitive or superior in many respects, but whose operational use had been undermined by the logistics framework around it. For German analysts, the abundance of captured tanks and depots suggested an opportunity and a warning. On one hand, captured Soviet fuel and equipment temporarily eased their own supply constraints and offered insight into enemy technology. On the other, the scale of Soviet industrial output implied that the Red Army could reconstitute armored formations if given time to reorganize reports to higher command. Noted that future phases of the campaign might encounter Soviet tanks supported by improved logistics if the initial shock wore off and lessons were applied. Within the Soviet command system, early proposals for organizational reform reflected these concerns. Draft directives circulated that called for reducing the size of mechanized corps, increasing the number of independent tank brigades, and improving the ratio of support vehicles to combat vehicles. Discussions focused on creating more redundant and dispersed fuel systems, smaller depots farther from the frontier, more flexible truck columns, and stricter control over march distances and fuel consumption. These ideas would not be fully implemented immediately, but the first week's experience gave them weight. For the personnel who had experienced the fuel crisis firsthand, the turning point was less abstract. Officers and soldiers who escaped encirclement brought with them specific recommendations: closer coordination between corps and railway services, earlier evacuation of depots under threat, and the establishment of pre-planned alternate unloading sites. Their testimonies contributed to a growing recognition that fuel logistics had to be integrated into operational planning from the outset, not treated as a secondary matter to be solved once movements began. civilians and railway workers also participated in this adaptation. In the weeks after the first encirclements, evacuation plans were revised to give higher priority to fuel infrastructure and locomotives. Instructions for demolishing depots were clarified and rehearsed, aiming to avoid situations in which large stocks were destroyed in place, without benefit to Soviet operations or captured intact by German forces. On surviving rail lines, efforts were made to decentralize storage, spreading fuel among multiple smaller sites less vulnerable to single strikes. By the end of the initial week, therefore, the fuel catastrophe around Western Front mechanized corps had become more than a series of local breakdowns. For German forces, it marked a stage at which Soviet armor appeared simultaneously dangerous in individual engagements and constrained by fragile logistics. For the Soviet command, it forced a redefinition of mechanized warfare in terms of what could be supplied as well as what could be produced. The turning point was not an immediate reversal on the battlefield, but a shift in understanding that would influence how both sides approached armored operations in the months that followed. When the German encirclement west of Minsk closed in the first days of July, the immediate phase of large-scale armored maneuver for the Western Front ended. For many Soviet mechanized corps, the week of continuous marches and fragmented engagements culminated in ordered or chaotic withdrawals toward the east, often carried out on foot or with whatever motor transport still had fuel tank crews, whose vehicles had run dry, formed improvised infantry groups, carrying personal weapons and limited equipment. Artillerymen tried to save lighter guns that could be horse-drawn, while heavier pieces and many tractors remained behind. Withdrawal routes showed the layered traces of the fuel crisis. Near the frontier and around Bialystok, rows of burned-out and abandoned tanks marked the early march and first counterattacks. Closer to Minsk, columns of disabled vehicles stood in fields and along forest tracks where fuel had finally run out, or where mechanical failures could no longer be repaired. Some tanks bore signs of demolition charges or removed components. Others appeared to have been left intact in the haste of retreat. The density of equipment increased near major roads and river crossings, where traffic jams and air attacks had forced crews to leave vehicles and move on. For civilians in the affected regions, the end of this phase took the form of occupation and sudden changes in authority. Villages that had seen Soviet tanks pass in both directions now watched German columns move through, often accompanied by technical teams examining the immobilized armor. Local inhabitants were sometimes ordered to help tow damaged vehicles or clear roads. In other places, they lived among the remains of tanks and trucks that could not be moved, which became landmarks and, in some cases, sources of scrap metal over time. German units conducting mop-up operations inside the pocket compiled more detailed accounts of Soviet losses. Infantry divisions reported capturing depots with remaining fuel stocks and repair workshops filled with incomplete vehicles. Army-level documents counted the tanks found serviceable after minor repairs, and those beyond repair, due to deliberate destruction or battle damage. These lists, combined with earlier reconnaissance observations, provided a clearer picture of how many Soviet tanks had been immobilized primarily by fuel and maintenance failures, rather than direct hits in combat. On the Soviet side, the aftermath took shape in the reconstitution of command structures and the accounting of losses. Headquarters that escaped encirclement gathered surviving officers and soldiers, forming new staffs for fronts and armies now responsible for lines farther east. Reports submitted to the General Staff attempted to reconcile original strength figures with the small numbers of tanks and vehicles that had reached the rear categories, distinguish between combat losses, breakdowns, and equipment abandoned due to fuel exhaustion. The resulting totals confirmed that a large share of Western Front armoured equipment had been lost without prolonged fighting. Humanitarian consequences followed the military ones. The encircled area contained large numbers of prisoners of war, wounded, and displaced civilians. For captured Soviet tank crews, the fact that many had abandoned vehicles for lack of fuel did not change their immediate situation as prisoners transported to camps' medical services, already strained by air attacks and rapid retreats, struggled to cope with casualties from battles, demolitions of depots, and accidents during hurried withdrawals. Railway hospitals and improvised medical points on surviving lines east of Minsk received personnel who described marches on foot, air attacks on columns, and the loss of their tanks to fuel shortages rather than to direct fire. Railway administrations and depot staffs also faced post-battle tasks. On lines still under Soviet control, trains that had been halted or rerouted during the first week resumed movement where possible, carrying evacuees, remaining equipment, and fuel away from the front. At the same time, committees were formed to document which depots had been destroyed, which captured, and which successfully evacuated. These records fed into broader assessments of how the distribution network had failed and what might be salvaged for future operations. German exploitation of the captured area included systematic removal of usable fuel and equipment. Where depots had been taken with stocks still present, engineer and supply units transferred fuel to support further advances. Captured Soviet tanks, especially T-34s, were shipped to test ranges for technical evaluation. Some were refurbished and used in limited roles, while others served as stationary training aids. The presence of these vehicles in German inventories underscored that their loss to the Red Army had stemmed largely from collapsing logistics, rather than inherent technical shortcomings. In Soviet rear areas, the after-action picture emerged more slowly. Families received sparse information about the fate of relatives serving in mechanized corps. Official communiques emphasized the scale of the German invasion and the need for further mobilization, while internal documents circulated among staff officers outlined the specific role of fuel and transport shortages in the Western Front disaster planning groups charged with rebuilding armored forces used these documents to identify critical vulnerabilities: insufficient trucks, inadequate depot dispersal, and over-reliance on rail lines exposed to air attack and sabotage. By the time new defensive lines began to form closer to Smolensk and the Dnieper, the material consequences of the first week were clear. Western Front had lost a substantial proportion of its tanks, including many T-34s, through abandonment and immobilization as much as through battle. German forces now held key logistical nodes that had once been central to Soviet fuel distribution. Civilians lived among the physical remnants of the campaign, while both armies carried forward the lessons of a week in which fuel planning, depot placement, and rail security proved as decisive for mechanized warfare as armor thickness or gun caliber. In later years, analysts on all sides returned to the first week of the campaign to understand why so many Soviet tanks, including a large number of T-34s, had become immobile before they could exert sustained influence on operations. Soviet post-war studies, drawing on Western Front logistics reports and surviving unit diaries, compared the number of tanks assigned to the Western districts before 22nd June with the much smaller totals that reached new lines near Smolensk and the Dnieper. The gap between these figures and the detailed notes on fuel exhaustion and breakdowns led to the conclusion that a very large proportion of Western Front armor, several hundred and possibly more than 1,000 vehicles, had been abandoned or captured in the first week, many without major battle damage. German documentation, including capture inventories and technical evaluations, provided a complementary perspective. Lists from Army and Army Group level recorded the numbers and types of Soviet tanks taken over in June and early July, with remarks about their condition. Entries describing intact or repairable T-34s and other models with empty fuel tanks matched Soviet accounts of vehicles left when supply lines failed. Together, these sources supported the view that fuel logistics rather than purely tactical factors played a central role in immobilizing Soviet mechanized corps on the central sector in that period. Historians have debated the relative weight of different causes within this broader fuel catastrophe. One line of interpretation emphasizes structural planning failures. pre-war fuel distribution schemes that concentrated reserves in a few large depots, insufficient motor transport, and unrealistic assumptions about the security of railways under modern air attack. Another stresses the impact of German actions in disrupting those schemes through targeted strikes on junctions and depots, sabotage on key lines, and rapid advances that overtook storage sites before they could be evacuated. A third highlights organizational compression in the Red Army itself, the rapid creation of large mechanized corps that outpaced the development of their supporting services and training. There is also discussion about how far the experience of June 1941 shaped subsequent Soviet armored doctrine and logistics. In the months that followed, mechanized corps were dissolved and replaced by smaller tank brigades with a higher proportion of support vehicles relative to combat vehicles. Fuel services were reorganized at front and army level, with increased emphasis on dispersed depots, alternate rail unloading points, and closer coordination between operational planning and rear services. Later Soviet offensives, particularly from 1943 onward, demonstrated a more systematic integration of fuel supply into operational design, including limitations on daily advances based on what rail conversion and truck columns could sustain. For German forces, the events of the first week were part of a larger pattern that initially seemed to confirm pre-war expectations about Soviet weaknesses. The combination of rapid territorial gains, encirclements, and large quantities of captured equipment reinforced confidence in the feasibility of a short campaign. At the same time, technical studies of captured T-34s and heavy tanks revealed an opponent whose industrial capacity and design choices could present growing challenges if logistics and training were improved. This dual impression of a state with both vulnerabilities and substantial resources influenced German thinking about future phases of the war, including the development of new armoured vehicles and anti-tank weapons. In broader historical memory, the immobilization of Soviet tanks in June 1941 has been interpreted in different ways. Some accounts focus on the apparent paradox of modern armour lost without extensive fighting, using Western Front as an example of how industrial output alone does not guarantee operational effectiveness. Others place the episode within a longer narrative of adaptation, arguing that the severe losses and fuel shortages of 1941 compelled changes that later enabled deep Soviet offensives when logistics, command, and production were better aligned. The experience of tank crews who abandoned vehicles for lack of fuel, and of civilians who lived for years among their remains, has informed memoir literature, local histories, and post-war commemorations along the former front. From a comparative perspective, the first week on the central sector shows how mechanized warfare depends on the interaction of planning, infrastructure, and enemy action. German panzer groups, though strained by their own supply constraints, managed to keep enough fuel flowing forward to maintain momentum toward Minsk's Soviet mechanized corps, despite fielding large numbers of T-34s and other tanks, operated at the end of a supply system that was still configured for peacetime conditions and offensive scenarios. When that system met concentrated air attack, rail disruption, and rapid ground penetration, it faltered. The fuel catastrophe of June 22nd to 30, 1941 on the Western Front therefore stands as an example of how strategic assumptions about logistics can determine the fate of advanced weapons in the opening phase of a war. The abandoned T-34s that became German prizes were the visible outcome of decisions made in staff offices and ministries before the first shot was fired. Where to place depots, how many trucks to allocate, how to balance concentration against dispersal, and how to weigh offensive intentions against the possibility of sudden retreat. Later campaigns on the Eastern Front, conducted by both sides, carried traces of these early lessons in every calculation of march distances, fuel norms, depot locations, and the operational reach of armoured forces.